Chapter 1. Welcome to London. Charles Dickens was born in Portsmouth, England, on February 7th, 1812. His father, John, worked for the Navy Pay Office. John earned a steady salary, and he liked to spend money on himself, his friends, his wife, and his two children, Fanny and Charles. Over the next few years, the Dickenses would have 7 children in all. With so many children and a limited salary, John needed to be very careful about how he spent his money. Unfortunately, John was never careful about money. If he didn't have money to pay for bread, he would put it on a bill at the baker's to pay later. By the time the baker was demanding to be paid, John owed money to many other people: the shoemaker, the butcher, the tailor. Even then, instead of saving every penny to pay them back, he would have an expensive meal at a restaurant. He always just imagined he'd find the money somewhere, but he never did. When Charles was 5, his family moved to Chatham, a naval town of the Thames River. Charles loved Chatham. He had lots of other children to play with. He enjoyed school. Sometimes Charles did not feel well. He suffered with pains in his side that kept him in bed. But his family had a nursemaid, a young woman who looked after the children. She was named Mary Weller. Mary told wonderful and terrifying bedtime stories to Charles. He also loved to read on his own. His favorite books were Peregrine Pickle, Tom Jones, and Tales of Arabian Nights. Sometimes he wrote stories of his own, like Misner, Sultan of India. He hoped one day to become as good a storyteller as Mary. Sometimes Charles and his father took walks around the town. One day they stopped in front of a beautiful house on Gad's Hill. It was large and made of brick, with a view of the whole countryside. Charles said he would like to live in that house one day. His father told him that if he worked very hard, one day he might do so. In 1822, when Charles was 10, his father was transferred to London, the capital city of England. The Dickens family moved to a neighborhood called Camden Town. London was a new world for Charles. There were over 1.3 million people living in London at that time. That was 200,000 more people than just 20 years earlier. London was growing fast. New inventions had led to an increase in factory work. People who once lived in the country now moved to the city for factory jobs. These jobs were often low-paying, and there were not enough of them for all the people coming to London. Many children had to take care of themselves while their parents worked. The streets were dirty and noisy. They were filled with people as well as carts, horses, and pigs. Hungry, barefoot children dressed in rags played in the streets and begged for money. School was a luxury only families with money could afford. At the Dickens' home in Camden Town, Charles slept in a cupboard in a closet over the main stairway. Charles's older sister, Fanny, was sent to the Royal Academy of Music to study singing. Charles no longer went to school at all. There wasn't enough money. Charles's mother had plans to start a school of her own. She sent him out to advertise a new school, but the only people who came were people to whom his father owed money. They banged on the door while his father hid upstairs. Sometimes John Dickens sent Charles to a pawn shop on Hampstead Road. Charles was sent out with dishes, furniture, and even his beloved books. The family lived huddled in 2 empty rooms with no money to pay for coal for the fire. They had sold everything they owned to the pawn shop. Even in this difficult time, Charles was growing to love London. He liked to listen to people talk on the street. He learned their accents and gestures and the slang they used. Whenever he heard an interesting story about someone, he remembered it. Then a friend of the family had an idea. Charles could earn money working at Warren's blacking factory. For Charles, this was terrible news. He felt as if his parents didn't think his life was worth anything. At the blacking factory, at 30 Strand and then later on Chandos Street, Charles worked with 2 other boys, Bob Fagin and Paul Green. Charles was supposed to have lessons during his short dinner break. But the lessons didn't last long. He lived like every other factory boy, working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Bob and Paul sometimes called Charles the young gentleman because he spoke and behaved like someone who had been educated. In England at that time, it would have been very unusual for a poor boy like Bob Fagin to ever advance into polite or high society. Charles was afraid that he would become a factory worker for life, just as Bob probably would be. Charles's small salary wasn't enough to pay his father's debts. On February 20th, 1824, John Dickens was thrown into the Marshalsea prison because all of the money he owed.